So now, of course, the next question that you have is, how do I get one of those nice activity systems, right? And of course, these activity systems don't arise overnight. They are the process of decisions that have been made throughout time, throughout the organization. Now, one element that probably has to be in place in order for these activity systems to arise is some amount of strategic continuity. If we are trying to change our strategy every 3 months and we try to reposition our firm every half a year, it is probably very hard for an activity system to arise that has high internal consistency. Because again, everyone within the organization has to understand what are the trade-offs that we are engaged in. And that takes time to communicate. Our customers have to understand what we stand for, and that takes time to build up that reputation in the marketplace. And so if we want to achieve an activity system that has high internal fit, we probably have to be steady in our positioning. But let's be clear what this means. It doesn't mean that we cannot change anything. The overarching direction in which we're going shouldn't change. So again, let's think about Walmart, for instance, right? Walmart, big discounter, has for many, many years had the same type of strategy. We want to be the low-cost provider. Now, the way they have actually implemented that particular strategy has changed dramatically over time. Quite often they had been on the forefront of new innovations that allowed them to push that particular part of the efficiency frontier even further out than other firms have done. So it's not to say that we cannot change the way we implement our strategy, but if we want to get high internal fit, we probably have to be steady in the type of direction that we're going for a while. What we want to do is we want to assemble a set of activities that is quite distinct from those of our competitors and that is highly reinforcing. Why does that lead to more sustainable competitive advantage than if we base our competitive advantage around 1 or 2 key things? Well, because it forces competitors to copy an entire system. Now, you might say, well, why is that so difficult? Well, the problem is you may not even know what is actually the entire system. So some of this thinking became clear actually in the late 80s, early 90s, when the Japanese car manufacturers entered Western Europe and the North American market in force, and everyone was really puzzled. How can they have such low cost and such high quality? So I remember General Motors' first response was, well, we need to figure this out. So they sent some engineers over to Japan. And those engineers came back and they said, we figured it out. It's just-in-time delivery. It's wonderful. Every 3 hours, a supplier truck comes to the gate of the plant with exactly the parts they need. You go inside that plant, there is no work in progress. There is no buffer stock between different workstations. So if there is a problem somewhere, you can immediately spot it. That is really what is driving Toyota's or Honda's efficiency. So General Motors said, well, that's easy. We have power over our suppliers. So they picked up the phone and they yelled at the suppliers, all right, in 2 months we're starting just-in-time delivery. All right, problem solved. Not quite, right? Because in order for this process to work, you actually would have to know which parts you need within the next 3 hours, which means that you need to know which cars you want to produce, which means you need to know which cars you're going to sell. So that really didn't quite work out. And the poor suppliers to GM, basically what they did was build a big warehouse full of stuff, wait for the phone to ring, and send the truck over. So basically, we just shifted inventory from one plant to another plant. So GM said there must be more to it. So they sent the engineers back to Japan. And the engineers come back and say, now we figured it out. It's flexible machinery. They have these wonderful industrial robots that allow them on the same manufacturing line to very quickly switch from one model to another model. Within a few hours they can do that switch, whereas we in Detroit, we have to shut down a plant for 3 to 4 days to make a model switch on a production line. So GM says, not a problem, we've got lots of cash. They spend about $1.5 billion buying the newest and glitziest industrial robots. They put them into the plant, and what happens to productivity? Nothing. So now they're really confused. So now they're asking some of their Japanese colleagues to come over, and so they call in some friends from Toyota and said, could you come and have a look? So those Toyota managers arrive and they say, look at that, newest, glitziest industrial robots, very interesting. But then they ask, could we see your production log? What models, what products do you produce on this line? And so they look at this production log and they say, well, that's odd. right? You have all this flexibility in your machinery, but you only build one model on this line. What's going on? And GM says, well, yes, we understand, but in order to use the flexibility, we would actually have to train our workers. And worker training is union regulated, etc., etc., etc. So slowly it dawned on them that really what they had to copy was an entire system. It was not just this practice or that practice. Now, at around this time, someone said, oh, you know what? It's Japanese culture. Japanese culture is a key element of the lean manufacturing system. We basically need workers who are so dedicated to the firms. I mean, they're practically willing to die for the firms, right? That's the kind of dedicated worker you need for lean manufacturing to work. And too bad we don't have it. Now, at that point, for better or worse, Toyota knocked on the doors of GM and said, we have a proposal for you. We seem to have some capabilities of running plants, and you have lots of capabilities and knowledge about marketing, selling, and distributing cars in the US market. Maybe we can do a joint venture where we run a plant together and we teach you how to manage a plant, and then we'll produce the same product under 2 different nameplates, and then you will teach us how to sell and market and brand our product in the US. Now, the fun thing was that one day I told the story and I have a gentleman come up to me and say, oh, I was actually in the boardroom of General Motors when that discussion happened. So I was very excited and asked him, so what happened? And he told me, well, Roger Smith, the CEO of GM at the time, said apparently the following. He said, let's stick it to them. Let's show those Japanese they don't know how to run a plant in the US. So GM came back to Toyota and said, wonderful idea, let's do that. And we know exactly which plant we would like you to run. It's a plant in Fremont, California. It's a plant we just shut down and we fired everyone. Yeah, that's the plant we would like you to run. You know, the reason we shut it down was because we had the highest quality issues, we had the highest absentee rates of our employees, the biggest labor unrest. It was actually a plant we couldn't make work. That's why we shut it down. That's the plant we would like you to run. Oh, and by the way, union regulations require you to rehire exactly the people we just fired. So you cannot just go out and get your own people. You are stuck with our people. Toyota said, okay, fine. So we rehire all the people you just fired, except the top 100 managers. That's where we're putting in Toyota folks. And you may know the story. A year and a half later, that Nummi plant in Fremont, California was running at about the same efficiency rates as all the plants back at home in Japan, which was about 2 to 3 times as efficient as any GM plant here in the US. So what have we learned from this little story? Well, what we have learned is that Japanese culture apparently was not a key element of the lean manufacturing system. Now, today we get a little chuckle out of that story, but at the time, you didn't know. Right? And it was part of that uncertainty of whether that actually was part of that system or not that created another barrier of imitation. So what this example I think nicely illustrates is why an entire system can create a sustainable competitive advantage, because it may be really hard to understand what does all belong to that system. Now sometimes it might be even hard for a firm itself to understand what the entire system is. So let me give you one example of that. We talked a lot about Intel, right? So one of the key things about Intel is that as they introduce a new microprocessor, how quickly can they ramp up their production? And Intel basically runs these very complex systems, their manufacturing fabs. There are lots of interdependencies within those technologies. So it takes them actually quite some time to ramp up production, to get efficient yields when they have a new generation of microprocessors come out. But then the question becomes for Intel, at that point, we have to open up plant number 2, and we would like to start plant number 2 exactly at that efficiency level where we left off with plant number 1. We don't want to go through this whole learning cycle again. Now, Intel has invested lots of time and effort in understanding what are the best practices of knowledge transfer, right, from one plant to another plant. And after many, many studies, the only thing that they found really works of how to transfer the knowledge from plant 1 to plant 2 was a policy they termed copy exactly. And when they mean exactly, they mean exactly. They might say, oh look over there, there's a kink in that pipe. I have no idea how that kink got in that pipe, but we better reproduce that kink in the pipe in plant number 2, because who knows what that kink does, right? Maybe it slows certain things down or cools certain things off. Likewise, Suppliers are sometimes quite upset with Intel because the suppliers have always to keep some of the old manufacturing products that they sold them for plant number one. They always have to keep that in store because Intel wants that old version. You remember that old version you sold me for plant number one? That's the version I want for my second plant. Because I don't want your new version, because I don't know how your new version will interact with the rest of the system. If I get to the next generation of microprocessors, again, you can sell me your new stuff, but right now I need that old equipment. So if you can imagine that even Intel sitting inside has such a hard time figuring out what all belongs to the system and how does it interact. Now imagine you're AMD, one of their competitors, standing outside the company and having to discern that. So again, complexity creates a very potent barrier of imitation and maybe really allows a firm to sustain their competitive advantage.